Hi, I'm Carrie Eubanks, Vice President of Supply Chain at L3Harris. I have 17 years of supply chain experience across government and commercial programs in the defense industry, both domestic and international. I'm excited to work with all of you. Our mutual success depends on building a world-class supply chain and operations partnership that delivers greater value to our end customers, who are entrusting us to deliver affordable mission solutions to protect our world. We expect the same levels of performance from our partners as we demand of ourselves. In today's threat environment, a key element of supplier performance is cybersecurity vigilance. To that end, the Department of Defense announced a new certification program known as Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. To protect controlled, unclassified information on DoD contractor systems, we must implement appropriate levels of cybersecurity controls and processes. CMMC is a roadmap to help suppliers assess the maturity of their cybersecurity controls and increase their overall security. All DoD contractors, primes, and subcontractors will need to achieve some level of CMMC certification to work on DoD contracts, even small companies holding limited technical data. This webinar is the first step in meeting the new compliance requirements. Please feel free to ask questions. Thank you for participating in this webinar series. Now, please join me in welcoming Ed Bassett, the Chief Information Security Officer of our partner, Neosystems.
Hi, thank you, Carrie, and welcome everyone. This is the first in a series of 5 webinars, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC. This one is introductory. We'll talk about the CMMC initiative, why we're doing it, what to expect in terms of the criteria that's been laid out by the DoD, and a little bit on how to prepare and how to be ready to pass the certification assessment. Future webinars are going to dive of each of the levels and give a little bit of technical detail on what you need to do to meet the specific items required for that level. So let's start at a high level and take a look at CMMC. First of all, this is a new unified security standard for the defense industrial base. It is DoD specific. It does incorporate some previous standards that have been published by NIST and others, but there are some new things happening within CMMC that have not been previously imposed on the defense industrial base. Second, this measures both technical practices as well as the maturity of processes. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail about what that means in a minute, but there is an element here of more than just a technical checklist, but also a look at how cybersecurity has been institutionalized within your organization. There are 5 levels of increasing rigor. So as we look at CMMC, there is a lower levels for companies that don't handle a lot of sensitive data, maybe have a smaller, less complex IT footprint, and don't need as much cybersecurity as those companies who process more sensitive data and have the additional threats that they're exposed to. Very big change with CMMC is that there's an independent third-party assessment. So while current requirements on the defense industrial base under the DFARS have a self-attestation component where contractors self-certify that they are compliant, within CMMC, this is an independent party that's going to make that determination and issue the actual certification. So that's a change not just in the criteria, but in the process that's followed. And the standard that's being published for CMMC is intentionally designed to be certifiable, meaning that the requirements are clear enough that there's a pass-fail, you get certified or you don't based on the criteria. This is going to be mandatory for all of the defense industrial base, but recognizing that there's a lot of complexity to get this out to the 300,000 or so contractors in the defense industrial base, DoD is anticipating a 5-year rollout. So some of you will see this in 2020, others over the next 4 years beyond that. And lastly, this is mandatory for all DoD contractors. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about how that might apply to specific types of contractors, but the idea is that this regulation is intended for the entire supply chain. So that means that all of you on this call today, as suppliers to L3Harris, very likely to require CMMC certification. Before we dive into some of the details about how CMMC works, let me just take a quick minute and talk about why the DoD is doing this. What's the motivation? Got three items really that I want to mention: money, people, and math. So on the money side, DoD recognized that there's a tremendous amount of intellectual property of the U.S. economy that's being stolen by our state-sponsored adversaries. So cybercrime globally and the cost just on the United States, the numbers are on the screen. They're very large amounts of money. It's having a significant impact not just on our economy but also on national security. So the goal of CMMC is really to deter those attacks and slow the flow of our intellectual property to our adversaries across the globe. On the people side, the defense industrial base, very large and complex, estimated about 300,000, some estimates 350,000 companies that supply services or products in some way to the Department of Defense. So it's a very large number of companies, very large swath of the U.S. industry. And in studying how the current requirements that were published a few years ago under the DFARS around cybersecurity and exploring how those were interpreted and how they were implemented by different contractors across that broad industrial base, the finding of the DoD was that there was very inconsistent interpretation of the requirements. In some cases, they were not well understood. There was a lot of confusion about what some of those requirements meant, and the implementation was inconsistent. So even though companies were self-attesting to compliance, what they actually did was varying greatly between companies. And the result of all this was that it was creating an environment for our adversaries in which they were able to target those adversaries successfully and succeed in stealing our intellectual property. There's a report noted down at the bottom in the footnote there, published by MITRE. It's called Deliver Uncompromised. It's a very interesting report. It's really the genesis of the CMMC initiative. And one of the findings in that report, over on the right-hand side of the slide, is a quote. The finding of the report was that there is an over-reliance on trust in dealing with contractors, vendors, and service providers, and that's encouraged a compliance-oriented approach to security, doing just enough to meet the minimum while doubting that sufficiency will ever be evaluated. So that sentence says quite a bit about the problems that they were seeing as endemic across the space. And the solution proposed by MITRE in the Deliver Uncompromised report was to structure acquisitions so that contractors have a profit motive to enhance security. And CMMC is the outcome of that. It's intended to make security an allowable cost, a measurable item within DoD acquisition, something that essentially levels the playing field. So things like we saw before with inconsistency across contractors, the intent of CMMC is to level that out so that things are very consistent, very understood, and everyone is held to the same standard. That said, there's an intent also to raise the bar and raise the level of cybersecurity that contractors are putting in place and have them do a better job about securing the assets that are entrusted to them by the DoD and do a better job at deterring attacks coming in from our foreign adversaries. So how does this apply? How does CMMC apply to you as a supplier to L3Harris, to you as a member of the defense industrial base? First of all, it's designed to enhance protection of data that's stored and processed by defense contractors, specifically controlled unclassified data. Does not address classified data specifically. There are still separate regulations around how classified data is stored and processed, but controlled unclassified data represents a large amount of data out there, as well as data classified as or data considered federal contract information or FCI under the federal acquisition regulations. Nearly all contractors process FCI in some way. The definition is very broad. CUI is a much smaller, certainly certain kinds of information that meet the classification, the criteria for CUI, so a smaller percentage of contractors. But CMMC applies to both, and I'll talk about how the different levels of CMMC apply depending on the type of data that you store and process. The applicability of CMMC has been published as all contractors, all DoD contractors and subcontractors, anybody in the supply chain, even if you don't store or process sensitive data like CUI or FCI, the intent is that CMMC will still apply. There's been some discussion of exemptions from CMMC for companies that provide only COTS services, commercial off-the-shelf services. The details around that have not been finalized yet, so I think at this point it's safe to say that if you're providing services to the DoD, you're most likely going to need to certify. You may qualify for that COTS exemption if the things you're doing are not tailored in any way specific to the DoD, but are sold commercially. So stay tuned. If you're in that category, stay tuned as that criteria is refined and published by the Department of Defense. This initiative does build upon some things around contractor cybersecurity that are already in the DFARS, the 252.204-7012. That's a current requirement on most DoD contractors. It is intended to be changed, and I'll talk on a future slide about the changes that we expect to see there. It also builds upon a NIST standard for security of contractor systems called NIST SP Special Publication 800-171, effectively incorporating all the items from that existing standard. So it doesn't per se replace the standard, but it supplements it with some additional items. And I'll talk in detail about how those items come into the different levels. The DFARS requirement, that 252.204-7012 clause, contains some other requirements around contractor flow down, around incident reporting, around use of cloud services and making sure that they meet FedRAMP security standards. Those items are not expected to change in the DFARS requirement. So it's not being replaced. It's being augmented. Here's a quick look at the implementation timeline. DoD has said that they're going to take a crawl, walk, run approach to CMMC. CMMC drafts were published last fall and winter. The initial version of CMMC was published in January, and the current version, version 1.02, was published in March of 2020. What's happening right now is that the CMMC accreditation body, the nonprofit that's in charge of implementing CMMC for the Department of Defense, has been formed and is now gearing up to let assessors be registered and trained. That's just happening over the last few weeks. In fact, last week they started allowing companies to apply for that status. So it's expected that the initial assessors will be trained mid to late 2020. The DoD has also said that for the first year of CMMC, they're going to do about 10 to 15 Pathfinder contracts, and those are expected to be announced in late 2020. They have said that they're not going to add CMMC to existing contracts. Rather, they're going to take CMMC and add it into new contracts as well as add it into existing contracts at the time of renewal. The rest of the contracts beyond those initial 10 to 15 Pathfinder contracts are going to be having CMMC added over a 5-year rollout period. So you may be thinking, if we're looking at only 10 to 15 contracts, the chances of me being in that first year needing CMMC are probably pretty low, but the DoD has said that they expect around 1,000 contractors to be affected. So these are large contracts that they're going to choose that have a lot of suppliers, a lot of subcontractors involved. So if you're on major DoD contracts that get picked as a Pathfinder, even if you're fairly far down in the supply chain, you'll still be affected in this first round. If you're not part of one of those Pathfinder contracts, either as a bidder or an incumbent, then it's possible that you will be getting CMMC into your contracts as they are renewed or as you bid on new contracts that are coming out over that 5-year period. So I mentioned that the current DFARS contract is expected to change. I say expected in the sense that DoD has announced that there's a rulemaking in progress. That rulemaking is going through some committee evaluation. It has not been published yet for public review, so we don't know the exact language. We have hints at it from statements that have been made by the DoD, but we don't know exactly what to expect. What they've told us is that the CMMC requirements will be added in, which essentially replaces the current requirement to comply with NIST SP 800-171. As I mentioned, all the requirements from NIST 800-171 have been incorporated into CMMC, so there's no reduction in any of those. So any investment that you've already made in compliance with that will be beneficial and necessary to pass CMMC certification. Again, other things that you will be expected to see continue in the DFARS are some of the incident reporting requirements, where there's some specific requirements around the number of hours after an incident is detected that you have to report it to the DoD, the collection of data, and providing that data to the DoD and cooperating with any DoD investigation of a security breach. Those requirements are in the DFARS today and expected to remain in place. DFARS requires flow down to all subcontractors, and that applies to any subcontractor that you provide access to, any federal contract information or CUI information, controlled defense information. If you provide the subcontractor or supplier with access to the data, then you must flow down these requirements to them. There's also a requirement in the DFARS that if you use cloud service providers, those cloud service providers must provide a FedRAMP, must provide security controls equivalent to FedRAMP moderate. That is expected to remain or potentially be strengthened. It's possible that cloud providers will be required to have CMMC certification as well. We've seen and heard different discussions about possible reciprocity between those programs, the FedRAMP program for cloud providers and the CMMC certification, which applies to all DoD contractors. So again, we don't know exactly the details of that until we see the DFARS language published in draft, which should be out in the near term. So stay tuned for that. Next, let's take a look at what it takes to achieve certification. There's a lot of questions around CMMC. It's new. There's a lot of details. I would encourage, if you do have questions, please submit them in the question and answer window in this webinar. We will be answering some of those online here today, as many as we have time for. And for those we don't have time, then we'll be getting answers back via email. But let's take a quick look at what's required to achieve the CMMC certification. For starters, the M in CMMC, one of them stands for model, which is not very interesting. The other one stands for maturity, which is very interesting and very new. This is something that has not been evaluated before in DoD contractors. It is in other areas. For instance, CMMI in the software development space measures maturity of your software development practices. So the idea with CMMC is to mimic that and measure how well cybersecurity is institutionalized, made a part of your corporate culture, making sure that there's consistency across an organization in how cybersecurity requirements are interpreted and implemented and carried out in practice. In practice, what this means is that you'll need to have better documentation than was required previously. There's some specific requirements at different levels, which I'll talk about, and be prepared to show that maturity to the assessor when the assessor comes in to do their audit. So this is probably the biggest new thing that we're seeing within CMMC. CMMC, as you might expect, adds a little bit of new language, a little bit of new lingo in terms of how they've laid out their framework. So the two key items that we need to take a look at are practices and processes. And I'll dive a little deeper into what those requirements are at each of the 5 CMMC levels. The practices are basically technical activities that are required to be performed to achieve the security goals, and the processes are procedural activities that demonstrate maturity and institutionalization. So those two buzzwords, processes and practices, will appear as you move forward looking at the criteria and how to comply with CMMC. So I mentioned earlier there's 5 levels. These build on each other. So for instance, if you want to get a level 3 certification, you have to meet all the criteria for level 1, level 2, and level 3 in order to qualify for that level. It is possible to get certified at a lower level, say level 1, and then later upgrade that to a level 2 or level 3 or higher level by adding additional practices and processes. The practices, as a summary, are laid out here on this slide. Level 1 is considered to be basic cyber hygiene and is intended to be fairly low bar, fairly easy for companies to comply with, doing things that are normally part of our IT activities for most companies anyway. As we move to level 2, that's intended to be intermediate hygiene. It is considered to be a stepping stone. DoD has said that they will have few, if any, contracts that require level 2 as the target level. It does comply with the FAR, which is also true at level 1, but it adds some additional practices. Again, intended more as a stepping stone for companies on their way to level 3. Level 3 is Named Good Cyber Hygiene, it not only complies with the requirements of the FAR, but it also encompasses all the practices from the current NIST Special Publication 800-171 and is intended to be sufficient for processing of controlled unclassified information, CUI. So this is a level that any company who has CUI within their possession is going to should expect to be required at a minimum. Levels 4 and 5 are proactive and then advanced and progressive security. These are designed for companies that process very sensitive data, perform very sensitive functions, and therefore are highly targeted by state-sponsored adversaries. So at this level, the expectation is that the security programs become more reactive, more proactive in deterring those advanced attacks. DoD has said that they think it's going to be a very, very small percentage of companies that need to be at level 4 and level 5. And the words they've used in some announcements have been, if you need to be at that level, you probably know it. Meaning, because of the work you do and the nature of the work you do, you'll be aware that you are doing highly sensitive work that might be highly targeted by our adversaries. On this slide, we see the advancement of the processes as well as they go from level 1 to level 5. At level 1, the expectation is just that you perform the practices that we saw on the previous slide. And as the levels go up, that they get those practices become documented and then managed and then reviewed and then optimized. Very much following the CMMI levels in terms of showing advanced levels of process maturity as you move up the chain. Now I'm going to take a look at each of the 5 levels to give an idea of what you can expect if that's the target level that you need to be at. At level 1, again, basic cyber hygiene. This meets all the requirements, the current requirements in the FAR for safeguarding of federal contract information. So it doesn't exactly match the language in the FAR, but it's intended to be an equivalent bar in terms of difficulty and challenge. In the bullet items there, the 17 practices, I've highlighted some of the top ones, some of the key items, not all 17. And again, as we get to the higher levels, the numbers get much larger. So I've just hit the highlights. If you want to see all the details, then of course dive into the standard and read about each one in detail. But I wanted to give an idea of the practices at each level that are likely to need some attention in terms of making sure that you have them in place in a way that aligns correctly with the standard. It's important to note that at level 1, it's sufficient to just demonstrate that you perform the activities. Doing the activities in an ad hoc way is sufficient. There's no measurement of process maturity, no requirement for specific documentation at level 1. They may be limited and they may be somewhat inconsistent across your organization. So that's an expectation at level 1. Level 2, as I mentioned, intended as a transition step, does not yet qualify you to process or store controlled unclassified information. There's 72 practices though, so it's quite a bit of quite a big lift from level 1 in terms of the detail of practices, and these include some things that are not common amongst especially small business IT departments, so may require some special implementation, some assistance in the detail of that. The other big change at level 2 is that there's a maturity requirement to establish policies for each of the capability domains and then also document those practices. So that means an SOP or other kind of documentation about how the practices are carried out to make sure that they're happening in a repeatable way across the organization. Level 3, this is the target level for a lot of companies because it's the target level that would qualify you to process controlled unclassified information or covered defense information in your contractor information systems. This is very much equivalent to what's required today under the DFARS 252.204-7012 clause for cybersecurity of contractor information systems. It encompasses all of the requirements from the current DFARS that stem from the NIST 800-171, as well as 20 new things. And on the next slide, I'll give a summary of what those 20 new things are. This is for any company that's currently complying with the DFARS 7012 or self-attesting that they're complying. This is a very small uptick in terms of what's required. Those 20 new practices, which I'll detail on the next slide, and then the maturity items. So at this level, you have to demonstrate not only what we mentioned in level 2, which was policies and procedures, but also establishing and maintaining plans. Those plans have to allocate adequate resources. So you basically have to demonstrate that you have a plan in place to carry out the security practices on an ongoing basis. And again, the resources are assigned. This will be something that the auditor will need to take a look at, so it has to be demonstratable that you have those plans in place. On the technical activities, there's a few highlights listed on this slide, but I think maybe more interesting is on the next slide. We'll take a look at what are those requirements that are above and beyond what's required today if you fall under the current DFARS clause. There's 20 new things. These things are additional to what's in the NIST SP 800-171, and they cover a lot of ground. Some things are things that most companies already have in place. For instance, performing backups and having the ability to restore from those backups. That's not a part of the current NIST standard, but it is something that most companies have in place. There's also some new things in here around centralized collection of audit logs, analysis and triage of events to support event resolution, so security information and event management kind of requirements, which many companies do not have. Again, it's not a current requirement, so this will be likely a new implementation. As you can see by reading through this list, it is quite a bit of ground covered in addition to what's in the current NIST standard. So again, not a huge lift, but definitely something that will need some attention if what you've done so far is to take yourself into compliance with the NIST 800-171. Level 4, I mentioned earlier, is designed to be a very small percentage of companies, most of whom will already know where they are. At this level, there's 156 practices, so the bar has been raised substantially above what the current requirement is under the DFARS. It's intended to reduce the risk from advanced persistent threats. So these are companies that are likely to be targeted by state-sponsored adversaries that have very large amount of resources and can attack over a long period of time, trying a lot of different techniques and have expertise in many techniques. This is very different than the threat posed by cyber criminals, who tend to have a fairly limited toolkit. They're looking for a quick hit. They're looking for some to extract some money from their victims, and frankly, they have a lot of victims to choose from. So if their victims deter them, they move on to another victim. Whereas advanced persistent threats target for a different reason. They target a company because they have that's on their list of things that they want to get, and they're willing to devote resources, try a lot of techniques until they succeed. So level 4 is intended to be proactive in this way, meaning that as the threat changes techniques, the cybersecurity program adapts, identifies those techniques, those attempts, and adapts itself to maintain a high level of deterrence. There is a requirement at the maturity level. At the maturity, there's a requirement to both review and measure activities to make sure they're being effective, and to review that status with high-level management, and that high-level management is taking action to resolve issues. So again, the program has to be sort of self-healing, self-correcting, adapting to new threats. Level 5 has 171 practices. This represents a very advanced level of cybersecurity, well above what most companies would do from a commercial perspective. So it's intended for those companies that need to be very resistant to very well organized, very targeted threats. The maturity requirement goes to optimization and standardization across the organization. As faults are found, that those faults are fixed and then shared across the entire organization. So there's an emphasis on consistency, there's an emphasis on improvement over time as weaknesses are found, either by testing or by successful adversary attempts, and that those optimizations get passed forward. In this next section, we're going to talk about preparation, the path to success. As I mentioned, CMMC is new. We're still waiting for a lot of the details of the security assessment process in particular to be pinned down. So the standard's been published so we can see what the expectations are at each level, but what we don't have yet is the assessment standard. How the assessor is going to check each item, what they're going to look for, what exact criteria they're going to use for a pass-fail decision on each level. The DoD has told us a few things. One is that they're going to use a pass-fail mechanism, and they're not going to allow for weaknesses or flaws to be captured as an exception or a plan of action item, as has been the case in the past, that if you don't have all the items in place to meet the standard, then they're not going to award that certification. You'll have to satisfy a lower level and take that certification. So that right there is a pretty large change. It does mean that preparation is going to be very important. There is enough new information, new requirements, that almost no company is going to be able to take their current security program and show it to an assessor and expect to pass. They're going to need to make some changes to align with CMMC, to incorporate the new practices that are required, and to make sure that their processes are up to par with the CMMC requirements. So even well-prepared companies are going to need to take some additional steps. So what do we recommend now for companies to do, even though this is on a 5-year rollout, and even though there's some requirements there or some details of the program that are not yet known, what are the things that can happen right now? First is that most companies, many companies who are subject to CMMC are already operating under the DFARS clause. So I will say that for starters, if you haven't successfully met all the requirements under the current DFARS clause and have full compliance with NIST 800-171, that should be a starting point because that's required today, even though CMMC is a ways out. So if there's any weaknesses there, any items on a plan of action and milestones that need attention, those would be important to take care of immediately, even before CMMC becomes reality. And then looking forward to CMMC and thinking about how to prepare for it, the first item I would recommend is to look at the scope of the CMMC audit and how you've segmented your systems. The big difference, one of the big differences between CMMC and previous standards is that the certification under CMMC is awarded at the corporate level. So companies will be awarded for the company as a whole, one CMMC level. If companies are split into subordinate operating units, they may potentially have different CMMC certifications for different units. So that amount of segmentation is permitted and possible. But it's not done at a system level, where current NIST standard talks about a system security plan and compliance on each individual system. Within CMMC, the look is at the company. However, the auditor needs to look at specifics of the IT systems when they come to assess the company and how the company handles cybersecurity. We don't know exactly they're going to do that yet, but the expectation is that CMMC will follow the data. So if you have systems that are used for DoD contracting and store FCI or CUI, those systems will be in scope for the CMMC assessment. If you have other potentially corporate systems that don't process that or are used for other commercial business not associated with the DoD, those systems may be out of scope and not looked at. So while the cybersecurity practices are intended to be done across the entire company, the technical details of how that's implemented can vary system by system based on what kind of data that system has. So thinking about how the scope of that audit, it's up to the contractor to define what will be subject to audit, which systems will be authorized to store and process controlled unclassified or other kind of DoD information. And it's going to be important to segment those. The smaller IT footprint you can show to an auditor potentially can lower the cost of compliance. And that's going to mean that you have to have effective mechanisms in place to segregate those systems from other systems that don't process Department of Defense data in a way that's reliable, so that the auditor can be convinced that you have truly segmented those systems that you're considering in scope from those systems that you're considering out of scope. Next item is to understand the gaps that you may have in your security management processes and your technical practices. As I mentioned, most companies are going to have to make some change, even if you're fully compliant with the current DFARS and you need to get a level 3 CMMC certification. There's some lift. There's the 20 new practices I mentioned, plus the management processes and having those correctly documented. So understanding what those gaps are and getting to work on them is something that can and should happen now. Of those gaps, if you have gaps in the maturity space, and again, not unusual that you would, given it's no requirement for those documents to exist under the current controls. There's a requirement for system security plan, but that's about it. Some of the other things that are required to demonstrate maturity under CMMC are a new requirement. So very likely a lot of companies will have this gap. I would recommend working on those maturity gaps first, because when you want to show maturity, having a track record for the assessor that the assessor can look at is very important. If the assessor comes in and you show a policy that was published the day before they got there, you can't demonstrate that you're actually following that policy. It's too new. There's no track record. So the earlier those gaps can be filled, and the more you can build a trail of evidence showing that you're actually complying with those, the more likely the assessor is to give a favorable opinion on the maturity that they see. And then after the maturity gaps, take a look at any practices that are missing. Again, there's some new practices required, so most companies are likely to have some gaps, and select the technical solutions. That may be technology you already have that's configured a different way. It may be new technology that you don't have, or new services that you need to purchase from a third party. Speaking of third parties, one recommendation would be, if you're trying to achieve any CMMC level above level 1, it's important to look for specialized service providers that can do that. Specialized service providers can accelerate the process maturity that's needed. They can bring in specialized skill sets as well as specialized technology that might be required. If you have existing technology partners, it's important to evaluate their commitment to meeting CMMC. Many commercial service providers, MSPs or MSSPs, managed service providers or managed security service providers, may not be aligned with CMMC. They may be providing mostly to the commercial marketplace, and they may do things in a way that doesn't show the right evidence, doesn't show the right alignment with the standards, doesn't show the right process maturity that's going to be required. The CMMC accreditation body published just last week a certification, or a registration rather, for service providers where they can be on a marketplace administered by the accreditation body as registered providers. And this is a way to know that you have selected a service provider that is aligned with CMMC. So it's a commitment by the service provider. It's not a requirement. You could certainly get services from providers that are not part of this program. It's brand new, so it's only been out a week, as I mentioned. Right now, there are 0 companies registered. A lot of companies that have requested to be registered, but none have been approved as yet. So this marketplace is just now developing. Once the marketplace is published, you can check your service providers to see if they're on there, and if they are, that's a very good sign. If they're not, it's worth the conversation with the provider to understand their commitment to CMMC and make sure that what they're providing is going to be of good assistance in getting the CMMC certification. And the last thing I'll suggest on partnering is, by moving to cloud providers is a really good way to shift portions of that compliance burden. There is a requirement under DFARS that cloud service providers are equivalent to FedRAMP moderate at a minimum. So again, we don't know how that requirement may change in the new DFARS, but certainly choosing cloud services that are FedRAMP listed in the FedRAMP marketplace is a very good way to make sure you've got cloud services that provide the security needed for federal compliance. And that doesn't completely shift the burden. If you have a cloud service provider that says they're going to become CMMC certified, which hopefully they will, or have some reciprocity with FedRAMP, that doesn't alleviate your requirement to get your company certified, but it can move a lot of the practices off to be performed by somebody else, and you can inherit and rely upon that. We don't know exactly the details of how that inheritance will be looked at by assessors, but it is pretty clear that that's going to be something that will be part of the assessment process. So speaking of the assessment process, I want to talk just a little bit about what the assessment process requires, or what to expect in that. As I mentioned, the standard for assessments has not yet been published. The training has not yet started. The first class is expected to happen late this summer. So we don't have any folks out there right now that can represent themselves as official assessors, but that marketplace is being formed. The registration started last week, and we're starting to see companies signing up. The designation that's been used by CMMC is C3PAO, or Certified Third-Party Assessment Organizations. These are companies that will engage certified assessors to perform assessments on their behalf. They can also provide certified assessment services or consulting services, but they can't do both, right? They can't do both for the same client. So it is a requirement that whoever you choose as your C3PO be independent, meaning you can't also use that company for consulting advice or security services or other things associated with your security. They have to be independent and not have any conflict of interest with other parties that you're engaged with. They are going to come and look for documented evidence of all the practices and processes. So again, it's going to vary dramatically. The level of detail is going to vary dramatically across the 5 levels. Level 1 may be a fairly simple assessment. They're not looking for maturity at that because it's not part of the requirement. So they're looking for evidence that you have those required practices in place. As you move up in the levels, it's going to be a more detailed assessment. The expectation should be that every single one of the controls, the required practices and processes, has to be demonstratable. So as you're designing those at this point in the preparatory phase, I would think hard about the evidence that's being generated. How would a third party be convinced? How would you convince a third party that you're actually following these policies and actually taking these steps in performing these practices? That's what the assessor is going to look for. As I mentioned, it is a pass-fail. So you either meet all the requirements of the standard at a certain level, in which case you get a certification, or you don't. If you're missing even one item, then you'll have to be certified at a lower level. So just a quick summary, and then we're going to open it up for some questions coming in from the audience. So CMMC, 5 levels. Those levels go from basic safeguarding of FCI up through protection of CUI, and then at the higher levels, reducing the threat from APTs. One of the big questions we've seen out there is, what level will I need to be at? And the answer is, you should think about the levels you're required to be at today, the kind of data that you process, and whether that data requires the protection as CUI or potentially higher. You can also talk to your contracting officers or prime contractors and ask them. Each contract let by the DoD will specify a level for the prime, but it's up to the prime then to decide on the level required for each subcontractor based on the kind of data and the kind of work that they're doing. So as suppliers to L3Harris, the question may be, how can we help? This webinar is part of a series of webinars. I mentioned there's going to be 5 total, promoted by L3Harris, presented by Neo Systems. There's also a Neo Smart portal that's been sponsored by L3Harris, intended to provide assistance to U.S. suppliers in navigating the waters of CMMC. So these on-demand educational webinars are a part of the portal, the Neo Smart portal, which you've all been invited to register. If you have not yet registered, the link is at the lower right on the screen. That portal will have the latest CMMC information, documentation, educational materials. These webinars will be available on demand. If other people in your organization need to see them, you can get access to them through that portal, and have them go through this as well. We'll also be in July offering a gap analysis option on the Neo Smart portal, where you can go through in detail and assess your security controls that you have in place against each of the CMMC levels and get an idea of where you stand. Get a score of your current readiness, and then project out the items that you'll need to do to come into full compliance. In July and August, we'll be adding additional things to the portal, so please keep an eye out. There are some analyst-guided consultative offerings around gap analysis, ability to contract for assistance with specific maturity documents that are required, outsourcing of the security program management activities needed for CMMC, as well as in August, we will be adding to the portal some cloud enclaves. This is an ability to move sensitive data into a cloud-based secure enclave where you can process that data and not have it be on corporate information systems that might not be involved in DoD work. So maybe a low-cost option, especially for companies that can or want to isolate that DoD data away from other data they may already have on corporate information systems that don't need CMMC, for example. So again, if you haven't registered, please go to the URL at the bottom of the screen and enter the prime code L3H 2020 to gain access to the portal if you've not already done so. This webinar sponsored by L3Harris, presented by Neosystems. Neosystems is running the NeoSmart portal for L3Harris. We also do provide managed security and managed IT and cloud hosting, so we can be part of the solution as you try to achieve CMMC compliance. If you have gaps either on the management side or on the technical side, then you can access some of those services or information about those services from the NeoSmart portal. We have about 15 minutes left. We're going to try to answer some questions that have come in from the audience. I see quite a few of them that have come in here. So joining me today is Jeff Baldwin, as well as some other folks from L3Harris Supply Chain Security that can help to answer questions live here on the air. So I'm going to look through some of the questions that have come in. If you have questions you've not yet asked, please enter them into the attendee question box on the interface, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So the first question is, will this be available afterwards, or will there be a link later for later viewing or download? And the answer is definitely on the NeoSmart portal. There will be a link in the education resources. There'll be linked to this and all the webinars so that you can look at them again later. You can share them with other folks within your organization. I don't believe they'll be available for download, but they will be able to be viewed on demand by anybody who needs to see them. Next question is, CUI is required to be identified. Has L3Harris started marking CUI on product prints and models? And I'll turn this over to folks from L3Harris if you could answer, is there any initiative to make sure things are identified or marked in terms of CUI data?
Yes, thank you. This is Joseph Palvino in the Government Compliance at L3Harris. We have already started marking CUI in relation to specific programs as it has been required based on the regulations out there. Many of our suppliers have probably not seen these markings yet as they're rolling out as an as-needed basis, but as we have been getting more and more programs, the marking has been showing up more frequently.
This is Jeff Baldwin. I will also add to what Joe just said as CUI will be coming from customer 2 from DD254s. So if you're issued a DD254 from us to you as a subcontractor, you should be also getting the CUI. I think that'll roll out over time. And before we get to the next question, I just want to say thank you for everyone taking time on your day to attend this. And the good news is that we are pretty early in the process, so we have a lot of time to plan. So as we saw in the presentation today, this is going to happen over the next 5 years. And as those next 5 years, our current guidance today is certainly going to change. So as it starts rolling out through the pilot programs, the government and DoD may adjust their guidance. So it's just good to take the time and stay up to date with CMMC, and we'll go to the next question. Thanks.
Thank you. Next question is, what is the definition of an incident that needs to be reported? Not strictly a CMMC question. The incident reporting requirements are currently under the DFARS 7012 clause. I had the citation on the screen a while earlier. So that DFARS clause does contain in the actual DFARS, there is a definition of a cyber incident, and there's definition of what would qualify. So rather than try to give a legal interpretation here on the webinar, I'll say that definitely should look at the language in the DFARS. Again, we're not expecting that to change under CMMC. We'll know for sure when we see the draft of the new DFARS clause, but the expectation is that those definitions and reporting requirements should stay the same. Next question is, will L3Harris helps subcontractors to evaluate which level is required for that subcontractor.
This is Jeff again. So yes, that should happen, but probably at your local level. So the contacts that you currently work with, they'll help you with what kind of level. But as we saw in the presentation today, some of that answers is, you know, is it controlled? Is it ITAR? Is it something you're already doing? Probably going to be a level 3. Another way that's a good way to describe the federal contract information is that information that the DoD considers not public. So if that's public information, then you're good. But if it's not public information, then you may want to go level 1. One thing that internally I'd like to look at doing from L3 to our supply chain is look at, you know, under the current way we've been doing business, we, you know, just forward things over, blah, 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 you get it all. But maybe we can, you know, maybe extract and only send things that you need. It's like a question of least privilege. Do you really need all that information, or is there a way that we can shield you to an extent to only provide you the information that you need that may make it, you know, lower the compliance thing. So that's just something that we're going to look at over time. But yes, definitely questions about what level you're going to need, that I would reach out to your initial supply chain folks that you work with today. And if not, you can always hit me up at the main mailbox that I spam you from. Thanks.
And this is Julian Smith. I just want to add to Jeff's excellent comment there. So we certainly could help you to grasp what you have been receiving to date and give you an idea as to what the future CMMC level might be. But as far as future contracts, that would be entirely dependent upon what the governmental requirement would be for the CMMC level within that contract. So we give you an idea of what you've been touching today, and in the future, if you had a different scope, it might be a different level, but we would cross that bridge when we got to it.
Yep. Julian, this is Joe. I just want to step in here a second. That's a very good point you bring up. As a reminder to everyone on the call, to handle DoD work for any contract that is not currently, as the regulations say, for commercial off-the-shelf items, you will need to be a minimum level 1. Whether or not you would need to be level 3 or higher, as Julian said, is going to be defined in the contracts as they come out. But if you're already dealing with sensitive data, data defined as CUI through the registry, which would include everything from controlled technical information to export controlled data, you will probably want to start working on a level 3 certification now. A lot of the requirements take time and effort to set up. And once these requirements come out through the DoD, you will need to be certified or ready for certification relatively quickly, so that we can begin utilizing suppliers on proposals as they have to be submitted.
Thanks. Next question is, how will Microsoft Office 365 GCC High, GCC is Government Community Cloud High, help with compliance? So I mentioned earlier, moving to cloud services is a good way to shift the compliance burden. So the Microsoft Office products, their Office 365 products, are all FedRAMP listed, FedRAMP moderate for their commercial product and their GCC product, and then FedRAMP high for the GCC high product. So definitely, because those systems have been looked at by the FedRAMP process, they will help quite a bit, right? These are systems that meet the federal standards that are in place today, and then they would be responsible for protecting the infrastructure upon which your data is stored and processed. It doesn't take the entire compliance burden away, because you may still bring that data onto your local systems to work on it, and so those local systems would need to be looked at. But you should be able to inherit security controls from Office 365 or other cloud providers. Next question is, will this certification be required for reverse logistics as well? I'll turn that over to the folks from L3Harris to see if they have an answer there on reverse logistics.
So this is Joe again. I'm just going to give my opinion on this one because I know it hasn't truthfully been talked about a lot in the industry from my understanding. But when you're looking at reverse logistics for the reuse of products or material, a lot of the level requirement, I think, is going to depend on what you're handling and what you're touching. So if you're just touching a basic good, maybe stripping the silver out of a piece of film, then you probably would be one of the lower level requirements. But as you start getting into more complex assemblies or pieces of information, you will probably need a higher level depending on what the original product was.
Pretty good. Thank you. Next question is, we provide plumbing service and repair only to L3Harris buildings. Are we certified? Does this apply to us? This is something that I'll answer from a CMMC perspective in terms of what we've heard from the authorities, and then I'll see if L3Harris wants to talk about it with L3Harris specifically. There's a story that's been told. I've told this story, but I've heard DoD officials tell this story as well. There was a big breach of credit card data some years ago by the Target retail store chain, and that breach was facilitated by an HVAC contractor that had put a heating control system, a server, in their corporate network that they used to access and control the HVAC systems. That was how the adversaries broke into that corporate network and ended up stealing a bunch of credit card data. So even though the HVAC service provider had nothing to do with any credit card data, of course, still, because their cybersecurity practices were weak, it still allowed a successful attack on the target systems. So again, I've heard DoD officials tell that story as a way to explain why they believe CMMC and good cyber hygiene should apply to essentially all folks who are supplying services to the DoD in any way. That said, it's most likely going to be at a level 1, the basic cyber hygiene. So, so very well may apply. We have heard word that there might be a COTS exemption. Would that commercial off-the-shelf COTS exemption apply to things like plumbing services where there was no sensitive data involved? It's possible. Again, we need to wait and see how that regulation gets released and the details of that get published. Anything to add on from the L3Harris side?
No, I think you've covered most of it. I know the only other thing that we are looking at right now additionally is the amount of access that some of our suppliers would need. If they aren't going into a critical area or they're only doing work in a public space, it's less likely to need certain certifications. But as they go into the higher security areas, there will probably be more vetting involved.
Got it. Makes sense. Next question is, what is the cost to get certified? I will say that none of this has been published yet, so there's no good understanding of whether there's a certification charge, the assessment costs at each level in a standard way, or will they be set by each assessor? We have not seen any of that, and there's no companies currently offering those services, so there's no to judge. The DoD has said that the costs around CMMC compliance, both the security measures you need to put in place and the cost of the assessment and certification, will be allowable costs under DoD contracts. But again, what the actual number will be, I'd say there's not any good information out there at this time. Next question is, will CMMC assessment/audit be based on DoD contract bidding only, meaning the supplier to be involved when part of the bid or chosen by selection from existing suppliers list, or part of the 3 to 5 year CMMC certification concept rollout plan? So I'm not sure I'm fully understanding the question. I think the criteria we've seen is that the certification is required at the time of award, not the time of bid. Originally, DoD had said time of bid, but they did revise that to say that it will be at time of award. Once you have received certification, the expectation is that it's going to be good for 3 years. So other contracts that you may bid on or be awarded in that 3-year period rely on that same certification. I see that we're at the end of our time. We have a huge number of more additional questions. I'm going to open it up for just a minute or so of closing remarks from the folks from L3Harris. Then I'm going to close it out. If we didn't get to your question today, and again, there's a lot of them that came in, I appreciate the participation. We will be sending out some answers by email. Things that look like they fall into the frequently asked questions, FAQ realm, that may have very, wide, broad interest in the answers. We will be publishing on the NeoSmart portal. So look there for some answers to common questions that are coming in. And feel free to submit other questions via the portal if you have some questions that way as well. So again, thanks everybody for your time. I'll open it up to see if L3 folks would like to give any closing remarks before we wrap things up today.
This is Jeff Baldwin. Again, I'll say thank you for everyone for your time. And I think we're at a good starting point in our preparation of this long journey that's ahead of us. And I'll clarify one of my earlier answers is if you do have questions about what level and all that, then you can send me and the team an email at cybersecurity_sc@l3harris.com, and I'll turn it over. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Anybody else?
None for me. This is Julian Smith. We will work hard to provide answers to those questions, and we value everyone's participation in the webinar today.
All right, and thanks to all who attended. As was mentioned, this is the beginnings of a new initiative, so there's going to be a lot of unanswered questions, obviously, at the start, and we hope to these webinars, as well as the NeoSmart portal, will be a really good resource for you in terms of keeping abreast of those developments as things progress, and providing a forum for you to ask and get answers to specific questions with respect to your relationship with L3Harris and how the CMMC program may affect that. So I want to thank everybody for your time and participation, and keep an eye on the email announcements as well as the NeoSmart portal for the dates and times of the future webinars. They will be happening about every 2 weeks, and we're going to be covering basically each of the 5 levels in some detail, and then having a detailed conversation in the last one, number 5, about the audit process and what to expect. And our hope is that by the time we get to that in August, we will have some more details about that been published, so that we can provide some more deep dive on the audit experience, the assessment experience you can expect. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.